I told you we were gonna do it. We tried something new today. We just did a meeting style. So as opposed to the webinar where we can't see you, if you'd like to um, join us on camera, you're welcome. You're all are muted right now, and but as we go through, we can unmute and ask questions as we go. So we'll give people a couple minutes to join. Hey, Keto, how was your tomato run?
All is well. The skin of my teeth.
Okay.
Uh,
glad you made it.
yeah, I just didn't want to leave them in the hot car. I was worried about splitting, so I was like, I gotta unload these things. So.
Oh yeah. So with the meeting style, people enter in through a waiting room, and so I have to like manually let people in, just so you know.
Okay.
How that works. So we can get started. We can still use the chat function if you guys want to chat in there, but I think, are you okay for folks kind of interrupting you as you go to ask questions? Unmute?
Yes.
Okay.
Then we're gonna go with the flow that we discussed, right? Okay.
Yeah, we can start off.
So I'll do I'll do a share screen and put up the slides, and we'll work it out that way.
That
Sound
sounds
good?
good.
Okay.
Yep. Hey, we're so excited, starting something new today, and we can see your faces.
Okay. Well, I was looking at the list of people, and there are some new names to me, new names and new faces. So nice to virtually meet you, and welcome. This class is intended as a kind of a refresher at this point in the season, and a discussion of things that could be thinking about at this time of the season for growing. We timed it with the distributions of fall crops this week, and we have a handful of pointers that will hopefully keep you harvesting all through until we get frozen ground or further. So that is that. And I'm gonna go ahead and jump into the slides here. As T had mentioned, so T and I are gonna be tag teaming teaching this class today. And please feel free to interject at any point, either via the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask any questions or clarifications about what we're talking about. This is very much wanted to make sure that you guys get the most information and are some things to maybe make your garden better. So let's click through the slides here.
Hang on, Keto. Betty says she can't hear. Is anybody else having that problem? If so, it may be something with your computer, Miss Betty. No one else is having that problem. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that folks were hearing us, since this is kind of a different style.
Okay. So you want to take it from here, or you want me to take it from here?
Why don't you start? And I saw some things on the next slide that that we that I wanted to make mention of.
Right on. Okay. Um, well, this is a kind of a pared down listing of what we usually have on the Plan Your Garden sheet every fall. This is just the things that we just distributed for fall crop, and these are all kind of appropriate things to be planting at this time of the year. I just wanted to reference this a little bit because I think this is a really useful tool for a number of reasons, and we'll be referencing some of this information as we go on. So we got a list of, I'm just going to kind of tick down some of the titles, and then we'll talk about what they are and in some of the details of why this is a useful tool. So to back up 1 second, this is every spring, beginning of the year, we put together a document we call Plan Your Garden, which lists out all the crops we're going to be distributing for the year. And it has what's going to be at the cold crop distribution in April, and what's going to be at the hot crop distribution in May, and then what's going to be at the fall crop distribution, which we've just been doing this past week. So and then on the back side is a listing of all the crops, their days to harvest, and there's a little subcategory of whether we're harvesting them either in the baby size or mature size, because some of them have that option. Spacing, which would be how many, in the case of seeds, how many seeds in a foot, or in the case of transplants, how much space between plants. And then some ideal times to plant these things outdoors. So we got all greens mix, arugula, lettuce. So those are all different types of greens or salads. There's beets, carrots, radishes, and turnips. Those are our rooting crops. And then there's a couple other greens, mustards, spinach, and then a few other things that kind of like cold are peas or snow peas in this case. And then with the transplants, we got basil, which is more of a refresher of a hot crop that we would be, that's going to go for until it starts to get a little cool, but it's, people love basil. And so that's what we decided to do for the fall crop. Most of these other things are more focused on the cool season. And then broccoli, collards, kale, Napa cabbage, those are all cousins that really like the cool season. Scallions, part of the onion family, and cilantro, another cool season lover. So please, make reference to this when you're planting things. And as we talk about some other concepts like season extension a little bit later in the class, this is going to be a useful tool to you. I also want to really highlight the spacing here. So make a note on the spacing that you have between plants. And then finally, let's look at this calendar. Okay, so in many cases, some of these things that prefer cooler climates do not grow well or germinate well in hot times. So for instance, arugula, all greens mix, and lettuce, they do not, and spinach, another one, does not like hot weather, does not germinate well, does not grow well when we have these 85+ degree days. So we're really reserving those seeds. They're going to shine a little in another month and a half. But some people are, you come home from a distribution and you're like, I got all this new stuff and I want to get it in the ground right away. Well, that's not, totally advisable. And it's something to think through on strategizing, occupying space in the garden. So that to note, and one other note I would say, if you are interested in growing carrots, is to get a jump on carrots as soon as possible, because we really want to because carrots take up to 2 weeks to germinate, and then another 60 days after that to get to full size, plus the fact that our days are getting shorter and shorter. The as a note, the general recommend, there's this listing of days to harvest. So that is to give you a general idea of either when you, in the case of the seeds, from the point that you seed them and they germinate, there's, in the case of beets, for instance, it's 60 days later you should be able to be harvesting beets, but it's not exact. And that's partially contingent on day length. And as the days, wane, we're past our, June 21st was the longest day of the year. And so we're tapering off now, and the days will get shorter and shorter. And as we get into the fall, these things will take a little bit longer to be harvesting. But these are kind of general guidelines, and it's going to be a useful tool when planning, and which we highly encourage folks to think about that kind of thing. And then on the right hand, if you were picking up, these were the two different family categories, just to reference along the, to look at these two based on what you decided to pick up for your fall crop pickup. Okay, going to the next slide here.
Sure. Was there any questions about that? I think that chart is so useful, and I think some people think there's like this magic thing that farmers know or have, but they're definitely using the chart or reference guide. So just want to make sure that was clear for folks.
And you know what? It's also on our website. If for any reference, like always, if you go to the Garden Resource Program section, it's always there with the listing of everything for this season.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also seeing a few questions here. Are these all things you could start from seed right now or plant by transplant right now? So the way that we set up the Garden Resource Program, we try and keep it relatively simple in that if it's something that needs to be started indoors, we'll start it indoors. And if it's something that does better direct seeded into the ground, then that's when we distribute things by seed. There are a few things that can kind of go either way. Lettuce, for example, would be one. Spinach, you can also start transplants of. Any root crop, definitely. Radishes, carrots, turnips, beets. They do not like to have their roots disturbed, because and so essentially you don't want to be transplanting those. Those definitely need to be directly sown. And then moving on, if I have a kale transplant, should I not be planting it until September? Let me look at that slide for a second. Well, no, I mean, if you're referencing the chart here, it says plant it in July. Kale is one of those things that, even though it prefers cooler climates, and it will thrive in the cooler climates, you can plant kale and collards, its cousin, in April, and be harvesting it all the way, all summer long, all through, into the fall, until it freezes. And then you can plant. Why we distribute it again in July is to give you kind of a refresh, and also because, it's a tradition with many families to do things like collards for Thanksgiving, and to have those frost kissed collard greens that have that sweetness to them. And instead of waiting all season long to harvest your collards, because that's what you want to have for your Thanksgiving dinner, we distribute them again in the fall for people to have that in a good time to be harvesting in November, right with Thanksgiving. All right, so and then okay.
Yeah.
So next slide.
Yeah, so when Keto and I were kind of talking about this class and what things were like really relevant for fall crops, just taking a step back to understand timing. So I think that's probably the biggest question I get that question the most often is like, when do I know when to plant what? That is the enigma of gardening. And so I realized that, so this year we have a lot of new folks to the program. And so I wanted to kind of just take a second to tell you a little bit more about how we select crops. and what you can expect from the Garden Resource Program. So like Keto said, we try to take some of the guesswork out of gardening in terms of when we distribute things. So if you're new to the, if you're old, been in the program, you know this, you kind of know this schedule. But if you're new to the program, which we had about 250 new gardens this year sign up due to, probably due to some of the food shortages that people were seeing with COVID. Um, but just to kind of give you an overlay of the Garden Resource Program, we start distributing seeds in March. So in March, we give you some of those things that that you may want to start indoors, or that you can start early in the season. And then we do a round of plants in April, and those are cold crops again. And then in May, we give you hot crops. So then come July, basically we're giving you another round of cold crops. So this is kind of setting you up for thinking about succession planting and taking the guesswork out of when should I replant things. And if you're a new gardener, this is a really helpful tool. As you get more experience, you're like, okay, let me throw in a round of, cucumbers. Let me throw in a round of lettuce here, and you start to think that through on your own. But we kind of lay it out in that fashion, and so you know that when we give you the things, they're just about ready to plant. And then you have days to harvest. Was that mostly what you discussed in the last slide, Keto?
Yes.
Yep. Um, so we talked about things to plant now, things to plant when the soil temps are cooler. So all of these, what we give you now are things that can tolerate a little bit more cool weather. And then preparing the garden bed for the first time. So this is a big refresher if you've been in the program sometime. But if you're a new gardener, this could be something that you don't know. So just thought we'd stick it in there in terms of making sure you know how to prep a bed for the first time if you're just getting going and you're just getting going in July. We want to make sure that and we have a number of videos on this on our YouTube page if you want to follow that. If you want to follow us on YouTube as well, but just making sure that you're pulling out. Some of your hot crops are ready to pull out, some of them are not, but you're pulling out what you can where you want to plant, and adding compost if you like. That's always a good idea to kind of refreshen the bed. I add about for a 4x8 bed, I like to add like a 5-gallon bucket of compost every time I plant. If you're going to rows at the garden, at the farm, we're adding wheelbarrows of compost every time we plant in there. And then preparing the soil, so loosening the soil, using a shovel or a broad fork, and then raking down. So just kind of a note for first timers, preparing your garden bed. And if you have any more questions about it, we can get a little bit more in detail. But I know some of the faces on here have been there, done this. But
Can I just add one note to that? So
sure.
One thing in particular is one reminder I would say for preparing the garden bed is that if you're planting seeds, you really want to work the soil enough that you have kind of a finer texture to it. You want the soil to be kind of broken up, not chunky and hard. You need to kind of create an environment for that small seed to be able to penetrate, once it sends out its radicle and it starts to develop roots, it's got to have an ideal home for those roots to go into. And if the soil isn't turned over or loosened up, adding the compost, as T had mentioned, is a really good combination there, because the soil actually, the compost acts as a way to help make a nicer texture to the soil as well. I'm seeing in the notes there's a question about what was the name of the fork you referenced for breaking up the soil, T?
Yeah, and I was just typing in there. We use a broad fork for our larger beds, and there's a number of videos that we've done on that, and I can share those out to the group. But if you don't have a broad fork, a simple shovel will work as well. So that was the type of fork, or a digging fork, just to get in there and loosen that soil.
Yeah, and a fork is nice because it kind of fingers, with the fingers of the tines, breaks through. You pry it through the soil, and that in itself helps break up and make that finer texture. A hard rake is going to help you in that turning over process too, to break up those chunks into that finer texture for planting seeds. Let's see. Any other thoughts on this slide, T?
No, I think,
Okay.
just as a new gardener, I think folks don't think about like aerating your soil. And
Right.
that's what I really wanted to drive home, that those roots need that air. So when you're transitioning and making sure you reprepping your bed, basically. So
Right. Okay, moving on. Okay, so spacing. We talked a little bit about spacing, and there is spacing recommendations also on your seed packets, whether it's from ones that you would got from us, or spacing that's on a package from other seed companies that you may have gotten things from. In particular, I want to just call out thinning, because it's something that is a little bit of a foreign concept. It doesn't make necessarily a logical sense that you put this effort into putting these seeds in the ground, and then you're going to water them until they start growing, and then you're going to pull them out. Like, why do that? So the concept here is that carrots is kind of a poster child for this. It's classic. You plant them densely, and then you thin them out to have enough space that each carrot can develop appropriately. Part of the reason why that is advised is that most seeds are not 100% germination rate. So if you want to plant as much as possible in a small amount of area, if you want to try and maximize and then pull out plants between to get to that end. Whereas if you decided, okay, well, I know that carrots ultimately want to be 2 or 3 inches apart to be able to get it to a nice sized carrot, then I'm just going to plant one seed every 3 inches. Well, if if the first one is doing good, and then the second one doesn't germinate well, and then the third one does good, then you got 6 inches between each carrot and a lot of wasted space that you could have 6 carrots in, for instance. There are, in some cases, you can thin and replant them, or thin them and eat them. Most everything that you're thinning, with rooting crops and leafing crops in particular, you can eat as like a little snack when you're pulling them out, but in the end, seed is expendable, and it's a useful tool to get the most out of the space that you're growing in. For transplants, spacing sometimes doesn't seem right or feel right, because you have a plant that's this big, it's 3 inches, 4 inches tall, and you put it in the ground, and it's it's a kale and it's telling me here I needed to have these kales 12 to 18 inches apart. And so I got two plants that are this big and I'm planting them this far apart. That looks like so far apart. Why can't I plant them there, this far apart? That looks more appropriate. Well, you have to consider what the mature size of these crops is going to be. A collard plant is going to get, or a kale plant is going to get to be 2 to 4 feet tall, in some cases 2 to 3 feet tall, I guess, and have a canopy that's 2 to 3 feet in diameter. So if you consider that you want, ultimately, when they grow to size, you want their leaves to be touching and their centers to be appropriately spaced, then that's why the 12 to 18 inches will ultimately serve you as a good spacing. So that's just something to keep in mind. Some people try and push the envelope and plant a little bit closer. You can kind of do that sometimes. Fertility becomes a challenge. That's the other thing that you have to consider, is that these plants will ultimately have root systems that have somewhat of the equivalent of whatever the canopy of the plant is above the ground. They have a root system similarly below in terms of the space that it occupies. And if the things are too close together, then they're going to be competing for the resources in that soil, and you will tend to have stunted plants, or plants that just don't quite get to the mature size that you would expect typically. I also want to highlight succession planting. So succession planting is, we kind of built that in basically as part of the garden resource program when we do this fall plant distribution. And it's simply the concept of, a lot of these crops that we're growing, we grow them and we harvest them and they're done. There's the radishes, the beets, earlier in the spring we grow peas. Peas have their day, and then at some point they're just not producing anymore. So at that point you should pull them out and plant something else. And also this concept, part of this concept is basically that how much do you really want to be harvesting at any one particular time? So if you plant a 4x8 bed of, just strictly carrots, then you're going to be getting carrots all ready to be harvested all at once. Or radishes, for instance. For me, radishes, I like radishes, but I don't want, for me and my family, I don't want 30 radishes every week. That's just way too much. I can't eat that much radishes. I want 5 or 10. So I'll this week, for instance, or like say we're going to wait with my radishes, I'm going to wait until it cools off. So say in the middle of September, I'm going to plant radishes on September 15th. I'm just going to plant a 3-foot row, 3-foot row of them. And then the week after, I'm going to plant another 3-foot row. And then the week after that, I'm going to plant another row. And that way I'm staggering the planting, and then I will get a staggered harvest, which is a really useful tool. You can take this a little bit further with putting together some kind of garden plan similar to what you see in this slide here. This is one way of doing it on a spreadsheet. And again, we have this in a format you guys can build out for your own site. It's a little bit intense for 3 raised beds, but let's just take a minute to go over this, and I'll kind of explain how that relates to succession planting. So basically, this chart, the lines going horizontally are sections of 3 raised beds. So I broke up 3 4-foot by 8-foot raised beds into 4 2x4 sections or 8 square foot sections. And you can see that illustrated below. So we have the bed broken up into square feet, and then the representation of the horizontal lines of each of those sections of the beds. And then the vertical lines are the weeks, represent the weeks of the year. So I could, in theory, build out a calendar or a garden plan for my entire year. For a home gardener, don't, like, if this is too much for you, just let it, just listen and don't worry about it too much. This is more to introduce the concept, and there's many ways of planning a garden, and this is, but to look at this sheet gives us a concept of how much we could really be planting in one area. So as an example, if we're looking across the top line in the first section of our first raised bed, 1A, I got lettuces planted. And I know I'm going to plant lettuce in the middle of April. So you can see the head lettuce is planted, the second or third week of April. And I know that it's going to take about 50 days or, a little bit over a month to come to harvest. And that's represented by that H at the end of May. So I know I'm going to be pulling that lettuce out of the ground at that point, and I could be planting something else in that same spot right afterward. So I give it a garden a little bit of a break, and in mid-June, I'm planting bush beans that's going to continue to harvest. And bush beans, they're going to taper off about the end of July, beginning of August, and then I'm going to do a little break again and do spinach. So this is that concept of trying to, some people think about gardens I think in a kind of traditional way, or if I think about my grandfather and how he used to do things, is like on Memorial Day weekend, you plant your whole garden and that's it. You plant once and then that's your garden for the year. And you can do a lot more once you get to know each of these crops and how they kind of lay in, and how you can set up successions and that kind of thing. So that's succession. I'm going to go back to this last slide for a second, just to talk about cut and come again as a concept. So just so there's a few seeds that are on the list that were distributed for fall crop. Am I broadcasting okay? My internet.
Yeah, you started to break up for a second, but you're back.
Okay.
Right.
All right. So we got a handful of different greens here: arugula, all greens mix, lettuce mix. To some degree, mustard greens kind of fits here, and then spinach. So all of these could be planted either in a dense planting, and you can see there, 60 seeds in a 60 seeds in a foot. So they're kind of saying here to plant a dense planting of them with the intention of just harvesting when they're 3 or 4 inches tall. So we have it's for baby leaf salad mix essentially. And the other way that you could be growing those is to plant them, spread them out and to grow them to be bigger in size. But for the baby leaf salad mix, it's you can be done as what's called a cut and come again, where it'll continue to grow. So you could go, once it gets to that 4-foot height, if you cut right above the growing point, about an inch and a half above the soil, you can cut off more of the mature leaves, and harvest those to be eaten. And then you'll get another flush of growth that would be, the second or third or fourth harvest, something along those lines. So, play around with that this fall. It's really, if you like salad, the greens tend to be more tender. And you know, it's something to a really useful method. Okay. So, what's going on in the garden this time of season? I've referenced some of these things, but I just wanted to kind of, you know, work through my notes here and let's just kind of talk about the season. We got, you know, here in the market, looks like we had a little bit of rain and it's coming down. And this is really, July is harvest. You know, it's a big thing is to stay on top of your fruiting crops. And, you know, many of them you want to be harvesting before zucchini is, you know, as an example, or cucumbers, you want to harvest them when they're just the right size. And sometimes if you give it 24 hours, it's going to, you know, it balloons up and, yeah, right in front of your eyes almost. So, that you are, the more you stay on top of harvesting, it's also gonna, excuse me, the more you harvest, that gives the plant the energy to put into other fruit, you know, the next generation of fruit. So if in effect, the more you harvest, the more you will get fruit set. Let's see, when are crops, quote unquote, done? And this is something that really plays in because, you know, in many cases, we're working with limited spaces. And so maybe you've already have most of your garden planted out and full of stuff, and then you just got a round of fall crops, and what do you do with them? How are you going to create space for them? So, I mean, the first thing is, and it's a general recommendation to be thinking ahead, whether you're using a, you know, some kind of schedule like I had referenced in my previous slide, but reserve space anticipating, you know, fall crops. And then at some point you have to make, you know, there's going to be a point in the season, you know, with tomatoes, for instance, where tomatoes will continue to produce fruit, you know, until the frost, but they'll kind of slow down, and you'll get, you know, some small green tomatoes that are, you know, they're not even, not quite even big enough to harvest for green tomatoes, you know, for the uses that those are intended for. And so, especially if you want to get a good late season crop planted, there just comes a time where you just have to say, well, okay, it's done. Like I'm going to cut my losses. I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to get much more out of this. And something, you know, and a lot of, particularly with tomatoes, anything that's relatively green and to size, especially you want tomatoes to be somewhat, they turn almost a light green or a whitish. They'll be like green, light green, whitish, and then they start to have color. If you harvest in that phase, you can ripen them off the vine, and that'll be just fine. And then leafing crops are gonna, particularly collards and kale and Swiss chard is another one. They're just gonna go and go and go, and you know they will. There will be a point where if you are harvesting regularly, that it's going to slow down a bit, and that's maybe a good reason to plant another round. Particularly, you know, and I also want to reference here Craig's question. So then it appears too late to plant any more kale for the fall? No, absolutely not. I mean, we distributed kale for the Garden Resource Program. You could plant baby kale seeds now. You're in good shape. And then rooting crops are basically, there's a window, you know, rooting crops will get tough and pithy if you leave them for too long, like radishes, if they're, you know, if you don't harvest in a good time frame after, you know, you expect their harvest, they're going to start to get kind of soft and pithy on the inside. Beets will get just kind of oversized and, you know, tough on the outside. So really you want to be checking on those things regularly. Carrots is one of those things you have to kind of feel around with your finger in there to get a sense of how big the top is before you harvest it and pull it out. Other things that are happening in the garden right now is just staying on top of weeds. You know, we're feeling at the farm a little bit of a tapering off of weed pressure, even though, you know, weeds are just an ongoing tribulation. I think the tapering off is because we just haven't had as much rain. We'll probably get a flush after today's rain. But in particular, the best way to keep weeds from dominating in the garden is to try and get them small. So, you know, walking through your garden regularly on a weekly basis at least, and assessing the weed pressure and trying to knock them back. You know, it's a lot easier to kill small weeds with a hoe of some sort or pull them out manually than to be going through and having to pull out by hand these, you know, 4-foot tall pokeweeds or pigweeds and all that kind of stuff. Also, when you're doing walks around, I guess this is just a note in general to, you know, when you're keeping a garden, highly recommended that you walk around the garden, inspect plants up and down, look for curling or like deformed leaves or holes in leaves. Like, have a sense of, is there damage happening? And then, you know, there's ways to you know, through some, you can actually watch a few of our previous classes on pest management to get some more pointers related to this. But in general, you have to identify, okay, is there damage? What does the damage look like? And then figure out who's doing the damage. And then once you have that figured out, then you can get a sense of what to do.
Mm-hmm. Did you see that question in the chat about weeds and versus native plants?
Yeah. Well, experience is really gonna, you know, well, a number of things that come to mind here. So if you till this ground over or turn it over, the likelihood of native plants being there is probably kind of slim. Sometimes you'll get volunteers of things that maybe are in perennial gardens that are adjacent, like, you know, you have some purple coneflower or something that's growing nearby, and, you know, you left the seed heads, and ultimately you know, you get some little sprouts of these things popping up, and you know, usually you can identify that by looking at the leaf versus the leaf of the, you know, the thing that's could be a weed or not. And then other than that is maybe leave it a little longer and see what happens if you're, or don't do this, don't sacrifice what you've already invested in terms of your, you planted these vegetables here, and this other thing is volunteering and invading on the space and taking up, soil resources and water resources, and just say, okay, well, I don't care what you are, I'm pulling you out because I put my energy into this garden. So those are a few things to think about. A few other questions here. Do we like neem oil in general? I'm assuming you're referring to as for using with pests. Neem oil's fine. It has its uses. I would not recommend spraying anything on the garden without if you as a blanket thing, without having a specific pest you're trying to deal with. And if people have specific questions about pests, we can address those a little bit, but we're not going to get too deep into that today. But in short, neem's good. And then any tips or methods of deterring cabbage moths or cabbage worms? Honestly, yeah, so there's a reference to a white moth too, right? So cabbage loopers, or imported cabbage worm, they're also called. So you would be seeing the white butterfly with the dot on its wings, in the middle of its wings, flying around the garden. That's the adult form. And then the caterpillar is what really does the damage, and that is a green caterpillar that you'll see on things in the brassica family, so collards and kale and cabbage and things of that sort. The best way to address them is to be inspecting your plants, and grabbing the worms themselves and squeezing them, killing them, whatever, or hire a nice 10-year-old and give them a quarter a piece or something. And then also inspect, particularly if you see a cabbage looper on a plant, then you also should make sure and inspect the undersides of the leaves of that plant and look for little the eggs of the immature larvae, or worm caterpillar. They'll be like in a row, little suspended pinhead size, roughly pinheads or slightly larger eggs, and smush those, because those are going to be causing you problems down the road. We have a resource list of both through the Garden Resource Program for compost. So T, would you want to, can you speak to that?
Sure. Sure. If you are a member of the Garden Resource Program, we typically budget for a yard for a community garden and a half a yard for family gardens. And we have 3 pickup places in the city. At this time of year, it may be kind of rough pickings. So if you could shoot me an email at info@KeepGrowingDetroit and just reference that you're still looking for compost, because we usually have those things available in the spring when people are really getting going. But there may be a few sites with some left, so I want to make sure you get to the right one. So if you're looking for compost from the Garden Resource Program, yeah, shoot me an email. If you're looking to purchase and you're not a member of the Garden Resource Program, perhaps, or you're looking to purchase more than that amount, there are a number of farms in the city that are selling compost for you to pick up. One is Brother Nature. I would find them on Facebook. There's a few landscaping companies, depending on what side of town you are on. If you're on the west side, we tend to go to Detroit Landscaping Company, right on Schaefer, or Panetta's if you're further west, that's like on Telegraph. There's Eagle Landscaping Company, and then there is Alamans on the east side. So those are kind of 4 or 5 resources. But like Keto said, if I can definitely send you a list if you like that list in print form. Just send me an email and say, can you send me the compost list at info@keepgrowingdetroit.org. Hope that helps.
Great. So moving on here, we talked a little bit about pests, but I particularly want to highlight prevention. So with pests and diseases, the first line of defense to have less issues with these things is to have healthy plants. I like to say it's like similar to us. If we are eating well and getting exercise and drinking water and all those things, we are less prone to getting sick or having health issues. And plants are the same way. So that relates to plant spacing, fertility, water, and access to sunlight. So if any of those things are, they're not adequate, then you may have stress in the plant and they're going to be more prone to pest problems. So we talked about spacing, and we'll talk about water in a second here. And then fertility was referenced in terms of the compost. So that's, another reason to try and add compost at planting times. And then we didn't talk about this earlier, but just a note is, I guess we'll be talking a little bit when we're talking about season extension, but plants need sunlight. They need at least 10 hours of sunlight. And if they're not getting that, then that's another factor for stress. And then, do you have anything to add to that, T?
No, I was just thinking, if we had a couple minutes I feel like the most prevalent that I see in the fall is that cabbage looper for some reason. But if you want to just speak to the other pests that you typically see in the fall, I mean, I feel like at this point in the fall, there's less beetles and things like that usually. But maybe just a note on some of the things that you'd see. I know that's like probably a big question. I don't want to go too far in the weeds with it, but
Yeah, I mean, well, all right. So the short list of pests are cabbage loopers. Short list, most common: cabbage loopers, flea beetles, cucumber beetles, tomato hornworms.
yeah. I mean, specifically for fall crops.
Right. I think for fall crop, inspecting the plants, I think in the end is going to be our biggest help.
I'd say maybe aphids too.
Yeah, aphids. Yeah, thank you. Aphids. So aphids are a soft-bodied insect. You can either, you're trying to get them. They're kind of that white grayish color, and they're small, and they tend to be lots of them concentrated at the main growing point on the plant. And we're really trying to, either blast them off with a strong stream of water, or you can use a soap solution of dish soap and a little bit of cayenne, so like a tablespoon of dish soap and a half teaspoon of cayenne in a quart of water, and mix that up and spray them on the plants. And that, because they're soft-bodied, it prevents them, it causes them to not be able to breathe. And then also diatomaceous earth, which is it looks like a white powder, but it essentially, on a microscopic level, it's has lots of sharp edges on it. And anything soft-bodied, whether that be the cabbage looper or the aphids, is another thing that can be sprinkled on the plants and used as a pest preventative measure. There's a question here: is there anything you would suggest that is okay actually spray on your plants to get rid of pests? So that's the soap spray. So again, you have to identify before you, I guess before you go and start spraying this or that, neem oil, soap solution, whatever, make sure you get a positive identification of what you're dealing with. I think I'm going to squash beetles or cucumber beetles is a hard-bodied insect, so that's something that you just do hand scouting for and try and get it in the larval stage. And I would just defer that. I think we need to keep going here with these slides because we're just keep moving. So I'm gonna leave it there, and we can try and, if we have some time, we'll try and address more of these questions on the pest stuff at the end. So watering, particularly right now when we're entering the time of the year that we're going to have less consistent watering. July and August well, I guess August at this point, we are in August. watering is going to be a big deal because, you know, this is one of the months that we have, you know, historically the least amount of water, though we didn't have that much water in July and now it's raining today. So, you know, Michigan keeps us guessing and climate change doesn't help. Um, so, but in the end, we need to stay on top of consistent watering for a number of factors. So we want to have, basically the general recommendation is 1 inch of water a week, or I think better stated is one thorough watering 1 time a week. And a thorough watering is essentially where you're watering, you know, this part A of your garden, you're watering the size of this board here, and then you're moving on to the size of this board here as an example, and then you go back to the first side and you water that spot again, and you're basically, we're trying to get water to penetrate 4 to 6 inches into the ground. And if we have extended, you know, periods of time where we have dry conditions, the groundwater below will, you know, be evaporated off and used up and whatever, and you'll have a lot of dryness. And if your soil gets super dry, it will actually it'll be hard to resaturate it. It'll tend to go down a little bit and then go sideways and not really get into the root zone that we're really trying to address. So that's why we do a watering, let it really soak in, and then water again and to just soak in deeper. Okay, moving on. Tips for making the most of your planting. We talked a little bit about when are your hot crops done, but essentially making a judgment call on, and another thing to think about here is, like, sometimes, you know, things just don't go how you had hoped. We had some cabbages that we grew at the farm this year that barely produced heads. It was really disappointing. And you know, cabbages are 60 days to harvest, and had been beyond that point. And it's, you know, yes, if we would have kept them in the ground, would we maybe have gotten, you know, some more full-size heads? That's a possibility, but it wasn't worth the real estate anymore. And so we pulled them all out, and we said, okay, well, let's just get ready for the next planting. So we're putting beans in there. Planting fall seeds really is, you know, is really kind of a reference to the scheduling. You don't have to plant everything right now. Think strategically about the space that's available right now versus a space that might open up in a few weeks when you're as you're pulling other crops out of the ground. And then as an option for you know, in the case where you just don't have much real estate at all to work with, you can do what's called potting on, or, you know, just basically take the transplants. You know, say you have a bunch of transplants from the Garden Resource Program and you don't have any place to put them right now. They're in these small cells right now, and likely they're really ready to get in the ground. And or get into a new home to access more fertility and to continue to grow. And you don't want to stunt them, because, you know, if they get too root bound, they may not recover from that very well. So one option is to get a slightly larger pot, a 4-inch pot or a gallon pot, and put some potting mix and compost mixed together, and put that in that pot, and you could plant them and keep them alive, keep them growing, and then ultimately you can put them into, you know, in their home in the ground, and you'll still have a really good setup. So intercropping is, I'm just going to mention this. This is just the concept of playing around with things that have staggered germination times or staggered planting times. So you could plant, you know, for instance, you could plant some radish seeds, you know, a little bit later in the season. You could plant some radish seeds right below your kale plants, because your kale plants will, but for at least a month or more, they're going to be relatively small, not much more than a foot. And so, and radishes are a relatively quick growing plant. They go 25 days from seed to harvest. And so that's something you could plant, have a crop, and while those kale plants are still maturing in that space that they're occupying. Another one is that people talk about, and this is maybe a slightly better fit for the spring, but planting carrots and lettuce seeds at the same time, because the lettuce will germinate relatively quickly. And then, so if you did like a row of carrots and then a row of lettuce, row of carrots, row of lettuce, that kind of thing, then the carrots will take about 2 weeks to germinate. In the meantime, the lettuce will start growing, and you can get a full harvest, couple of harvests out of it. And then, after 2 weeks and then 60 days to harvest, then the carrots, the lettuce will be mostly done. You can pull the lettuce out and let the carrots do their thing. And so that's another thing to think about. I think this is just another note I've been driving home, I think, the whole time here, is the most productive garden is always taking something out and planting something new week after week. So always, always, always looking for what situation where you could, how much, like maybe you planted too much of something and you realize it later. You're like, you planted, too much Swiss chard, and you're like, well, this Swiss chard looks great. It's doing really good. Swiss chard tends to it's one of those plants that always performs well. But you're like, I don't like Swiss chard that much. I like it, but I don't like it that much. And I have 10 plants of it. Take some of those out, and harvest all of what you can off of them, pull them out and plant something else. Like, there's no rules that you have to keep this plant growing. And always you should be evaluating what's in the ground, what can come out, what can be planted next, what can I plant in 2 weeks, that kind of thing. And finally, on this slide, I wanted to, we're making a note to really think about garlic. Garlic is one of these things, and we're going to talk about in this next slide, where you're going to be planting it now for fall harvest. T, you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, save some room for your garlic. I'm looking out of my window like, which bed am I gonna put my garlic in myself right now? So come October, we just harvested all of the garlic that we're gonna distribute to you all, and it's drying and curing right now. You will get another crop to pick up, basically. I don't have the exact date right now. Usually it's mid-October. So look out for that email for your next pickup day. And you'll get what looks like just regular bulbs of garlic that you pick up at the grocery store. But these are pretty special because they are the right variety for our climate to grow, which a lot of the stuff you get in the grocery store is called soft neck garlic. This is a hard neck variety, which is a little bit more suited for Michigan weather. And it's also a variety that's been growing in Detroit for, 10 years, Keto?
Yeah.
And it's called Motown variety. So we're gonna give you what looks like the regular garlic that you pick up in the grocery store. You're gonna crumble it up and get the individual bulbs. You'll plant the bulbs in the fall, October, November, and you're going to by July you'll have a full head from that one small. It's not called a bulb. The whole thing is called a bulb, but the small piece will give you a full bulb. So yeah, we'll probably do a class just on garlic at that point, but wanted to make a note here because a lot of times folks plant their entire garden out if they have 3 or 4 raised beds, and then they get the garlic and don't have room for that. So yeah.
Great.
And, yeah.
I'm going to reference a few questions in the chat here.
Yeah.
So Catherine made some notes about watering. Thanks, Catherine. I started seeds indoors. I use a 3-inch starting tray. Is that too big to start in? No, it's fine. That's fine. And, really, the bigger soil vessel that you can start seeds in is in the long run is going to be a benefit to that plant. It's just a matter of space. We grow things in the 4-packs or the 6-packs as a matter of efficiency for space to be able to grow so many. But if you start things bigger, then you'll have a little more time and they won't get pot bound and that kind of thing. So what could be my problem? I planted a single cucumber plant in a very large planter. It has grown tremendously as far as branches with multiple yellow flowers, but no cucumbers have grown. Boy, if you saw flowers, cucumbers should be, yeah. Oh, well, T already addressed that. Cucumbers should definitely be on the way. I think maybe just wait. If it's looking very lush and the plant seems to be healthy, then you should be probably fine. So
Especially if those flowers are there.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Catherine made a note that maybe that's maybe too much nitrogen, but no fruit. So that's possible, but the flowers is an indicator that you're probably still good though. So no, Craig, we do not have any kind of program for selling outside of the city at this point, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. But as T had mentioned, there will be seed. Okay, so let's keep going here on the slides. So this is another thing to think about. And if you're a beginning gardener, don't let this overwhelm you, and just listen. And I don't necessarily recommend trying these kinds of methods if you're just getting started, but it's something to know about and that it's out there. And if you're really new and green still, then maybe you'll try it in another year or two or something. But essentially, the concept here is season extension, and it's the idea of growing crops outside of our traditional growing season of April through October, and being able to be harvesting vegetables longer, even into the winter months, or even year round. And the idea is trying to use cold tolerant crops with succession and timed planting, and using some sort of protection, like essentially like what we call quick hoops. They are like a low rounded tunnel with a plastic covering, a little tent of sorts, to give a little bit of protection for the plants to be able to harvest during the winter months. So the basic concept here is, as I referenced a little bit earlier, plants need about 10 hours of sunlight to grow, and we have the longest day of the year in June, and then our days are slowly getting longer at this point of the season, and we are getting to the point by mid-November where the day lengths dip below 10 hours of sunlight, and at that point plants can still stay alive. Vegetable plants in many cases will still be alive, but they will not be actively growing, or if they are actively growing, it's very, very, very slowly. And so but what also happens is, if you have a plant that is almost mature to be harvested at that point in the season, by the middle of November, you can leave it in the ground and it's as fresh as can be, and you can harvest it when you need it. So this is basically a method of being able to trying to grow things out to have be able to still be getting harvests out of your garden all winter long. So that is, the short of it is, you were trying to work backwards from that November 15th date in planting these things, and then we can play around with different methods of protection, whether that be quick hoops or caterpillar tunnels or whatever. So, on the home scale, and I did not put a picture of the quick hoops in our slides today, and I apologize for that. But you could, if you Google quick hoops, there's tons of images to get a sense of what it looks like. And we have the essentially it's a metal or some kind of hoop metal that's 4 foot wide and about 4 foot tall. It's round at the top, where you would put row cover or fabric over it and tie it off to act as a protective layer for the crops that you have in the ground. And some of these crops are cool season. They're all, for this late in the season when we're talking about cool season stuff, and nothing fruiting can really work for this. So no eggplant, tomato, peppers, and none of that stuff. They can't handle the cold. But all leafing and rooting crops are really the stars in this situation. So particularly if you want to try anything, particularly if you're a beginner, spinach is the number one superstar of season extension. It tastes, after a little bit of frost on it, it tastes super sweet, and it's really a stellar example of a crop that to be harvested during the winter. Tastes way better than any other spinach at any other time of the year.
When do you do your last planting of spinach for season extension?
In probably late September. Well, and spinach is one of those things you could start as a transplant as well, but you need to give it at least, you want to give it a couple weeks to, we're talking about a 45-day crop or 30 to 45-day crop. And we're also adding a little bit of time because we know that the day lengths are shorter, so it's going to grow slower. So, we want a good month and a half before that November time frame. So September is really, that somewhere in that middle of September. What time is it? I'm going to leave. I think I'll just leave that season extension concept here as something just to chew on and to play around with. There's some notes there in terms of what, can tolerate freezing and such. I think I kind of went through the stuff here. And so let's kind of round things out with, with just, the concept of putting the garden to bed and some things to keep in mind for the end of the season. So we highly recommend putting the garden to bed at the end of the season. And the biggest thing that I want you to walk away from this with is we want to protect our living soil. So soil is the foundation of a healthy garden, which is going to ultimately get us what we want is some beautiful vegetables out of our gardens. It's not just it's not the dirt that just holds the roots of the plants that we grow. It's got millions of microorganisms and creatures that are working in symbiosis to help us do and grow what we want. And we need to maintain and manage that to have really healthy soil, part of which is by trying to avoid having open, uncovered soil at any point in the season. So mulching with leaves or straw as much as possible, and also trying to not let soil dry out or stay dry for extended periods of time, because that moisture, plays a factor in the lives of the microorganisms in the soil. So, manage your garden by pulling out all of the weeds and any hot crops. And this is going to be a task that you're probably starting to think about in October. Who knows, with the way that things have been going, we've been having pretty mild climate into November even. So, it could go later if you're comfortable with working in the weather that's, at the time. But essentially, the strong recommendation is to not leave any kind of crop residue in the garden that you're not going to be continuing to harvest from. So, don't just, abandon the garden and think about it next year and say you're just going to pull everything out and start fresh next year. Because lots of times pests can harbor in the plant material, leaf in the root zone of existing plants, and you want to really address that and avoid that, and compost or deal with those problem crops.
Yeah.
And then
Also, just to mention that is in the Detroit ordinance too, if you're in Detroit.
yeah, right on.
Mm-hmm.
And out of respect, and just to riff on that, particularly if we have street facing or open facing gardens, we definitely want to, have respect for our neighbors and try and keep things neat and tidy. And that's one of the things that we could do. So basically, and then cover the soil. And there's a question here: is it okay to keep weed tarp over for the winter? It's not a bad idea. Having some kind of, covering it with tarps. And we've definitely been playing around with that even during the growing season at the farm this season, where we'll till up a bed, and if we're not ready to plant it right then, to prevent weeds from really taking over, we'll cover it with black plastic until we're ready to get out there and plant it. So that's along the same lines of that concept. Other things to note here is, at the end of the season is really a perfect time to evaluate what you were growing and have and basically say, what did I grow well, and what did I grow too much of, and what did I not grow enough of, and making some simple notes like, I grew 6 kale plants and I wish I grew 8. And, and then I can plan ahead for that next year and make sure I have the space for it. It's while it's fresh in your mind, that before you pull everything out of the ground, you can make some quick notes that are going to be invaluable to you for setting up an even better garden in the following season. And then, when do I pull everything out except season extension plantings? Essentially, if you're kind of just trying to hold on to those mustard greens or collards or kale or that last harvest or broccoli, after the frost, those things will still be going. And even kale and collards can sometimes, make it through a mild winter, and you could be harvesting them in the spring. You just have to make a judgment call about what makes sense for you. It is still that concern for harboring, pests. In the case of those, would probably be flea beetles. That would maybe be an ongoing issue with that. So if you're trying to, you had a bad pest year and you want to have a clean slate, then maybe it's a good idea just to pull everything out and get rid of it. And then, as a limiting any factor or vector for pest problems, or pests being able to overwinter in the root zones of those plants or in the soil near them. And then, as just to reiterate, mulch is going to be a huge thing. Okay, well, that's what we got. And we are always open to questions. And I know, Catherine, thanks for speaking up. And I forgot to say something earlier in the class, but we're always encouraged, we always want to encourage people that have something to share. It's not just me and T up here, spouting all the knowledge in the world. We don't know everything, and there's always some things that we forgot. So please, bring your knowledge to the table in these classes. And I think that's it for, I guess, let's open it up to any final questions. And if we got a few minutes here, if anybody wants to put in anything out there that they're really looking to learn about, and if not, we'll wrap things up and we'll see you next time.
There are lots of fall crops left, so don't worry. There was a question there about were there still crops left for Monday pickup? Yes.
Okay, Fran, what's your composting question?
Hey, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, so I started a compost bin in a 5-gallon bucket, and I've been trying to only put things in there that I know don't have any pesticides in them, but I'm starting some of the things I come across I'm not sure about. Do you think I should maybe start a separate compost for those and just not add them to my garden bed because I don't want to, put things I'm not sure about, but I'd still
What
like
are
to
you
know.
not sure about?
Well, I just like some bananas that aren't organic, or maybe some citrus that has wax peeling on them, things
Uh-huh.
so I just I'm not sure if I should be careful about not, because the intention would be to put the compost in my bed eventually.
Right. Yeah. I mean, anything I guess there's it's not like you have lots and lots of banana peels. I'm sure you have, you have a bunch worth a week or something. So in the grand scheme of things, compost really breaks down, and a lot of those things are probably not too much of a concern. It really depends on your stance. If you want to be, limit any potential problem, then yes, maybe that's a good idea. Or you could just dig a hole in if there's appropriate space. Another way to kind of to get rid of that stuff without having to, play the mental games of is this going to be a problem for my vegetable garden, would be to, compost it basically by burying it and just letting in a non-consequential space in your garden back in the corner or something, where and that's what some people do. They're just if you're just basically managing waste, you don't want to throw it in the trash. That could be a resolve for that. I don't know, I don't know specifically what kind of pesticides are used on bananas and citrus. Typically, the more, there's you can look for there's listings of fruit that are more problematic in terms of ingesting than others. For instance, they say strawberries and a lot of the brambles, like raspberries and blackberries and currants, because they're so small and volatile, there's, they have pests, and so they're treated, and it's just hard to address. Whereas citrus, we're eating the inside of that, and that wax is more to prevent moisture loss. So you could either do some serious research to get to know that specific thing, or just move on and don't incorporate it. Hopefully that helps. Going down the list. Natalie, yes, I don't see an issue with the Napa cabbage going in a container you grew onions in. Again, I would just add some compost. With nitrogen fixing plants, beans, peas in my garden, I've been clipping off the stems and leaving roots. Should I be pulling these roots out or leaving them in my soil? Typically, those things are turned in or tilled in. And the tricky thing about that, I might pull out one of them. So yes, they can be nitrogen fixing, but usually you need to inoculate the seeds to make them nitrogen fixing with a specific inoculant, which on a small scale maybe doesn't, I'm not sure if it's worth the effort, but you know, it's more the finer roots, like, but you'll know that you're getting the nitrogen fixing if you can pull up one of the plants, the roots itself, just to have a visual identifier, and you'll see these little nodules, these little like small pea size, not even pea size, like you know, ball bearing size or something, little nuggets, little nodules, and that's the nitrogen fixing at work. So. And then Catherine's quick callback to the ginger and turmeric class. My notes say harvest in September, October as fresh young ginger. Has anybody pulled any of theirs yet to see how it's developing? No. Man, ours took forever. The turmeric, I didn't think the turmeric was going to do anything. Like, it just didn't. It wasn't growing. I planted it and I was like, I was basically thinking it was going to be a loss. And then, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, it finally shot up. And so I'm just going to wait. I guess we're going to probably, we'll probably pull one closer to that time frame, and just so you have a sense of things. I don't think there's any reason to pull it now, because really they require a long season. There's no harm in it, because you can harvest it at virtually any time if you're really curious, but I would just wait. And I don't see any more questions coming in. Oh, yeah, right on, Fran, thanks. Yeah, if you, and you can also hit Beaverland Farm up on Instagram. I'm not sure if they're on Facebook, but I know they have a presence on Instagram that if you wanted to poke out questions to them there. All right, well, it's been a pleasure seeing all your faces, and I think we're going to wrap things up there. I will make sure that T gets the slides, and then we'll share that, and we'll go from there. So have a good week, and we'll see you soon. Bye, guys.